Hey everybody, welcome back to the Vinyl Review. This is Billy, and today we are at episode number 11 in our album countdown. Now, we have been moving right along through the year 1965, and we've seen a couple of big releases from the Rolling Stones already, as well as a couple from the Beach Boys. We've seen the release of this monumental album, Bringing It All Back Home, by Bob Dylan. But we haven't heard again from the Beatles since we started off the series with their release right here at the very end of 1964. We had to begin this series somewhere, and that one seemed like the best place to start, and also possibly the most appropriate group to start with. The impact that the Beatles had on music and pop culture, starting in earnest on the international stage in about the middle of 1962, is just simply undeniable. Love them, hate them, ignore them, whatever. It doesn't really matter because their place in musical history is cemented, and their influence on other musicians, starting in the early years of the Liverpool Merseybeat scene, is well documented, as well as the British invasion years, all the way up to the very last recordings that they all made together as a full group in 1969. Hundreds of books and biographies have been written since that time. Documentaries with previously lost archival footage have been made into film, and thousands upon thousands of reviews have been released in print, in magazines, or can be found easily online with just a very simple Google search and the click of a mouse. Just even glancing at the Beatles' Wikipedia page, you will see that it is one of the longest entries of any musical group that you will ever find there. And because of this, we have decided to treat the Beatles in a slightly different way than just about all of the other groups and musicians that have either already been featured here or will be featured here shortly in the near future. In this episode, we are going to review their album Help, which they released on the 6th of August, 1965. But we're also going to talk some history as well. And we're going to try to focus on some of the lesser-known facts about the group, some of the more random events related to the band, and some of the more peripheral other people that just kind of came and went in their journey to becoming arguably the most famous and successful musical group in the history of the modern Western world. For example, we're going to eventually talk about Pete Best, who was one of the many short-lived drummers prior to Ringo getting the permanent position. We'll talk about Stuart Sutcliffe, the talented art student who was talked into attempting to play bass guitar for the group by John Lennon, even though he had absolutely no previous experience on the instrument at all. It was also Stu Sutcliffe who actually gave the band their famous name, and who also, unfortunately, died suddenly at the very young age of 21. We'll talk about manager Brian Epstein and their most earliest beginnings in the Liverpool area, the effect that they had on the other local groups and the Merseybeat scene at the Cavern Club, their residencies, along with all of their shenanigans in the music nightclubs of Hamburg, West Germany. What we want to do is to just try to dig a little bit deeper into the story of the Beatles, which has already been told and then retold so many times now that at some point, some of it just starts to sound a bit redundant. One big thing to keep in mind, and something that is worth pointing out right here at the beginning, is that the Beatles, as we know them now, all of their success and all of their worldwide fame, huge album releases, none of this came suddenly to them at all. And the Beatles were not always the Beatles. In fact, the beginning of their story, or at least the initial meetings and the friendship between John Lennon and Paul McCartney, goes as far back as the summer of 1957, when John Lennon was 16 years old. Right at the very end of 1956, he formed a ragtag musical group made up of neighborhood friends that he called the Quarrymen, named after the grammar school that all of these boys went to, which was Quarry Bank High School, located in the Liverpool suburb of Allerton. None of these boys had any real musical talent to speak of at that time. They played a genre of music known as skiffle, which was popular amongst the teenagers in the UK at that time. And while John Lennon knew a few basic chords on the guitar, the rest of them were basically just banging on pots and pans and using other weird household items and appliances as makeshift percussion instruments. If you want to know a little bit more about this particular style of music, known as skiffle, I would encourage you to go back and take a look at our episode number 4 in our series. And there's a good 20 minutes or so on there that we dedicated to that very topic. Look for a link at the end of this video for that. Anyway, Paul McCartney met John Lennon for the very first time on the 6th of July, 1957. Paul was 15. John was 16. They met in the Liverpool suburb of Woolton at an annual carnival that was put on by a local church in that area. Paul had ridden his bike from his own house in Allerton over to Woolton, and he watched intently as the Quarrymen played the very few songs that they actually knew on a tiny little makeshift stage that was set up in the open field next to the St. Peter's Parish Church on Church Road. At the end of this short set, which included traditional types of Liverpool folk songs such as Maggie May, but also Woody Guthrie's version of Cumberland Gap, and also a song called Railroad Bill, which was an American folk song about the famous train robber Morris Slater, who was killed in Alabama in 1896. That was a song that was made famous by Lonnie Donegan, who was kind of the UK's early version of a Scottish Elvis Presley, so to speak, who was skiffle music's reigning superstar of the day. So all I'm getting at here is that the Quarrymen were a skiffle group, just like hundreds and hundreds of other skiffle groups made up of teenagers all over the UK in the year 1957. And Paul McCartney was a fan of skiffle just as much as John Lennon was at that age. Paul was introduced to John by mutual friends named Ivan Vaughan, and then there was also Pete Shotton. Both of these boys were kind of like on-again, off-again musicians who played in John Lennon's Quarrymen group. Ivan Vaughan played an instrument known as the T-chest bass, and the other one played a washboard. Ivan Vaughan ended up staying friends with Paul for many years after this date, and he is usually the one who is credited as being the most instrumental in bringing Lennon and McCartney together for the very first time on this day. But he ceased his pursuit of music soon after this day, and eventually he went on to a career as a professor of psychology at Homerton College in Cambridge. But so close was he to Paul in later years that it was actually Ivan Vaughan's wife, Jan, who helped Paul write the French lyrics in the song Michelle. The only piece of trivial history, other than this one that we're kind of talking about right now, that could possibly be attributed to the second young man, Pete Shotton, who was not only classmates with John Lennon at Quarry Bank High School, but also a local hooligan and a troublemaker, is that his days as washboard player in the Quarrymen came to an abrupt end about 2 weeks after this carnival in Woolton, when a drunk and angry John Lennon grabbed the washboard and smashed it over the other boy's head at a party where they were playing. I think what happened here was that Pete Shotton was just a terrible washboard player, and John Lennon by that point had had just about enough of it, and the fact that Pete just was not taking his role as washboard player seriously enough in the Quarrymen. But here's the thing, and there's something a little bit more significant to this story rather than just comedy, and it has a direct correlation to the eventual musical partnership between John Lennon and Paul McCartney. And here it is. So let's go back for just a moment to that carnival in the field next to the St. Peter's Church in Woolton. Again, on the 6th of July, 1957. When Paul McCartney was introduced to John Lennon on that very well-documented day by Ivan Vaughn, Ivan said to John Lennon, "Hey John, this is Paul. He lives over on Forthland Road, and he plays the guitar too. And guess what? He even knows how to tune it." Yes, that is exactly what first caught John's ear. You see, even though someone, including his own mother and his Aunt Mimi, had shown John how to play some very basic chords on the guitar, but no one had ever bothered to show him how to actually tune the instrument. So every single time that his guitar went out of tune, he had to walk it down to a local music shop a few blocks away on Kings Drive, which was near his home at 251 Menlove Avenue, to get someone there to tune it for him. Now, I cannot imagine how ridiculously frustrating this must have been for him, because as a guitarist myself, I can tell you that the instrument basically goes out of tune on a daily basis, depending on how much you play it. So, Paul tuned up John's guitar for him on that day, which saved him from a trip over to the music store, and John was very pleased by this kind gesture. Paul also had another skill that John was told about on that same day. Apparently, in this time, decades before the internet, Paul McCartney had the uncanny ability to hear, interpret, and remember the words to just about any song that he heard on the radio or on a vinyl record that had no liner notes or lyrics printed on it. Remember, almost all of the records that these boys were listening to at that time were these little 45 RPM singles that came in nothing other than just a simple little paper sleeve. This one happens to be A Boy Named Sue by Johnny Cash. It was also much more difficult back then to get your hands on an import record that was being printed in the United States and not in the UK. Why this was considered an actual skill, I'm not exactly sure, but Paul used to keep these lyrics that he had written down on folded pieces of paper that he kept in his pockets. They were like little pieces of scripture or something. And if anyone wanted to know all of the lyrics, say to a song by an American artist such as Eddie Cochran, or Gene Vincent, Little Richard, or Carl Perkins, well, Paul McCartney was your man. And he had them written down on paper, and they were in his coat pockets. John Lennon wanted to play and sing many of these songs, and he often found himself simply making up words to songs when he didn't know what the actual lyrics were. I know that in this day and age, all of this sounds really weird, and you just have to remember that it was the 1950s, and they just didn't have the modern conveniences that we have today and take for granted, such as a Xerox copy machine, or the internet, or Google. Someone with Paul McCartney's certain set of skills made him both valuable and also threatening to someone like John Lennon, who had a bit of a complex when it came to the idea of the alpha male in any group of boys or young men that he was associated with. So yes, John, while he was both impressed and intrigued by this younger guitar player named Paul, who could tune up a guitar really well and also write down impeccable song lyrics by ear, he was also immediately threatened by the idea of someone younger than him doing something that he wanted to do himself, and in a few very specific ways was actually doing it better, somehow. So, after the carnival day was over, A few days later, John asked his friend Pete Shotton again about this other boy, Paul, who had tuned his guitar for him. John was trying to lean on his friend Pete to help him decide what to do and whether or not it was a good idea to ask Paul McCartney to join the Quarrymen. The initial consensus that he got back in opinions from Pete Shotton and this group of other boys that he played with in the Quarrymen, some of whom also knew Paul McCartney from the neighborhood, was that most of them thought that Paul was just a bit arrogant, and that as a pretty boy, he was always going to be the one who got the best-looking girls at parties. This was a very important factor to them at this point in their lives, John included. Someone also made it known to John that Paul also played the piano. He sang. He was a bit of a budding songwriter himself, and that he either wanted to join a local group or else he was just simply planning to start one himself. Now that's called local competition. John was also told that Paul was a bit of an eccentric and a somewhat odd guitarist in that he actually played his instrument upside down and backwards. He didn't actually play the guitar backwards. He was just simply left-handed. And much like Jimi Hendrix, he discovered that if he just put the strings back onto his guitar in the opposite direction and then turned it over left-handed, that he found it easier to play the chords with his right hand and to strum with his more dominant left hand. This is uncommon, but it's not weird or even odd. They just simply didn't make guitars back then that were designed strictly for left-handed players. They do now, but other than Hendrix, Kurt Cobain of Nirvana also played the guitar left-handed, as does Tony Iommi of Black Sabbath. But back to the Quarrymen in 1957. Here was the quandary that John Lennon found himself in at this point, as he was thinking about this other musician that he had just recently met, who lived just less than a mile away from him over on the other side of the Allerton Manor Golf Club. John knew his role as the undisputed leader of this little skiffle group that he had founded, but he also knew this, that they were going nowhere fast. John had to make a decision about his future, because at this point, he had decided that he wanted to be a professional musician, and that no other line of work held any interest for him at all. John was a rebel, and he was actually, for better or for worse, a natural leader. Now, he wasn't necessarily always great in his leadership roles at any point ever in his life, as a teenager or as a grown man in the most famous band on earth. So let's face it, we all know that John Lennon was kind of an arrogant prick, and he had his issues. But don't ever kid yourself. Paul McCartney could often be just as much of a prick himself, and he was equally as stubborn as John Lennon, and he had his own ways of getting what he wanted. He was not often that diplomatic in his dealings with his other bandmates in the Beatles. But let's try to stay focused here on this very specific time period. John did not want to relinquish any kind of control that he had over these other less talented classmates that were banging on garbage can lids in his skiffle group. But even at that very young age, and with his lack of maturity and his very rudimentary musical skills, he knew talent when he heard and saw it. One of the other things that Paul showed John on that day in July at the carnival was the chords to the Little Richard songs Tutti Frutti and Long Tall Sally. He even played Whole Lotta Shakin' Going On by Jerry Lee Lewis on the piano inside the church hall for the rest of the group of boys as they just kind of stood around and watched him in awe. You have no idea the impression that this left on John Lennon that day. He remembered that little moment for the rest of his life, and so did Paul. And because John had been consumed with these thoughts about how he might be able to balance the idea of giving up a certain amount of control versus actually working with someone who seemed like they were a cut above, musically speaking, than these guys that he was working with at that time. It made this whole smashing of the washboard thing over the other guy's head a bit more telling of where his thoughts were leaning. Now, smashing something like a washboard over some other dude's head might seem kind of like a dick move, but the guy who was on the other end of that washboard over the head thing actually stated many years later that he was kind of glad and also relieved that it happened. He knew that he had no real musical talent and that he wasn't even really playing a real instrument. Pete Shotton actually wanted out of the Quarrymen, but he didn't know how to say it to John directly. And these two remained good friends for the rest of John's very short life, with Pete actually taking a position as a personal assistant and a driver for both John Lennon and Yoko Ono in the late 1960s. John even bought an entire grocery store on Hailing Island and then gave it to Pete Shotton to manage. But what this incident had to do with John and Paul actually becoming successful musical partners was that Pete Shotton was one of the many people that were giving John mixed signals about this McCartney kid, who was by all accounts very, very different in his nature than the typical teens that ran around in John Lennon's circle of friends. John was a bit dour in his outlook on life, and he was blunt, and he was often very critical of others, very direct in his opinions about anything that he didn't like. And remember, John had a very difficult upbringing, and it was not always happy. He was raised by his Aunt Mimi, who was his mother's older sister, because it was decided in court that John's real mother, Julia, was just not suited to be a full-time mother for John, and by the age of 6, he was living at a different house with his aunt in another part of town. John Winston Lennon was born on October 9th, 1940, in Liverpool, and right directly in the middle of an air bombing raid by the Nazis on the Liverpool shipyards, which were less than a mile away from the hospital where John was born. He suffered some emotional trauma as a child, and no doubt, much of it could be blamed for his personality quirks that he developed later in his teens and would keep for the rest of his life. His mother was an energetic and a pretty young woman, but she was also lacking a bit in the area of personal maturity. She was known to be impulsive and amazingly free-spirited at a time and in an area where young women were expected to be much more conservative and more docile in their overall demeanor, especially in public. But she preferred meeting sailors on leave near the docks in Liverpool and dancing the jitterbug at nightclubs in the city until the wee hours of the morning. She eventually married a man named Alfred Freddie Lennon when she was 24 years old, just to anger her own father, who had threatened to disown her if she did not stop seeing this man whom she had known since about the age of 14. Freddie Lennon was charming and he was musically talented, but he was only marginally employed most of the time, and when he was employed, he was out at sea on various different types of military ships as a cook and also as an amateur musician on merchant ships. The man went out to sea on one particular work-related trip, and he didn't come back for 18 months. When he finally returned home, he found that his wife, Julia, had another child with a man other than himself, and their marriage just immediately began to disintegrate from that point forward. In 1946, Freddie Lennon actually abducted his 5-year-old son, John, from his mother's house in Liverpool and took him 30 miles north up the coast to the seaside town of Blackpool, where the man had plans to put himself and his son on a steamer ship headed for New Zealand, where he planned to stay permanently and raise the boy there. His scheme was soon foiled, though, and he was eventually found and confronted by Julia and various members of her family, including the other man that she was currently living with, before Freddie Lennon was able to board this ship and disappear to New Zealand. It was at that point that the young John was given the ultimatum that no 5-year-old should ever have to face, and he was asked by his mother which parent John wanted to choose to live with for the rest of his life. The young John Lennon was traumatized by this situation that was unfolding before him, and he most likely had no idea where he was about to be taken, and I doubt that he had ever even heard of the country of New Zealand at the age of 5. So the tearful young boy reluctantly chose to go back to Liverpool with his mother, and an emotionally crushed Freddie Lennon boarded the ship to New Zealand by himself, and he disappeared from his young son's life. He eventually came back to the UK, and he even met John in the year 1966. But this meeting was awkward, and it did not go very well, and they did not have a friendly relationship at any point after that meeting. By the time John's father was in his early 50s, he was still washing dishes to earn a living. So John gave his father enough money to buy a modest house, and then politely just asked him to simply go away. Freddie Lennon eventually went on to write a book about his brief time in John's life, but it seemed more like an attempt to cash in on his random attachment to fame more than anything else, really. As for John, like was already stated, he was raised primarily by his Aunt Mimi, who was a much more responsible woman than her younger sister Julia, but who had no other children of her own. While she was kind and supportive to John during his younger years, she was also extremely practical and very sober. She put up with zero nonsense in her household, and as John grew older, they began to clash, and they were often at odds about how John was performing at school, his grades, how he was choosing to dress, wear his hair, and the interesting friends that he was bringing around to her house. But it was actually Mimi who relented and bought John his very first guitar that he kept asking her for. She bought it, and she encouraged him to learn to play it, but she was never, at any point, supportive of the idea that playing the guitar was any form of practical or long-term employment. Musical instruments in her mind were just something that you did at home for enjoyment, and music was never meant to be any kind of a career choice in any way at all. John lost his real mother, Julia, on the evening of July 15th, 1958, when he was only 17 years old. She was walking away from one of her daily visits to her sister's house and over to the bus stop, less than 2 blocks away, where Menlove Avenue crosses Vale Road. She was attempting to return back to her own house by bus, which was barely just about 1.25 miles away, located at 1 Blomfield Road, and also where her son John was waiting for her arrival back home at that house. It was about 9:30 p.m., getting dark, and she stepped right out onto Menlove Avenue from behind a hedgerow, and a car traveling southbound on this busy road struck her at a high rate of speed and killed her instantly. She was 44 years old when she died. She was less than 150 yards away from her sister's home, and, ironically, less than 350 yards south of the entrance gate to Strawberry Field Park. The man in the car that struck and killed Julia Lennon that evening was an off-duty policeman, and it can be easily inferred that this was the point at which the young John Lennon developed his intense dislike for all authority figures, including any and all police officers, whether that hatred was actually warranted or not. The driver was not found to be at fault, and he was not charged with any crime related to this incident. He just simply didn't see her emerge from behind a hedgerow in the twilight of that evening. While John was not raised in his mother's house located on Blomfield Road, he was there often during his teenage years, and he was still very close to her. He often retreated to her home whenever he was at odds with his Aunt Mimi. And also because he was not allowed to have a record player in Mimi's house, he would often go to his mother's house where they would listen to Elvis Presley records together and where he enjoyed a much more relaxed lifestyle that he was not allowed to have at the house on Menlove Avenue. So let's go ahead and put a pin in this history lesson for now, because at some point we're going to want to switch gears and then start talking about Paul McCartney and his part of the story in the next Beatles episode, and before we get on with a review of this record. Let me also remind you that Paul McCartney actually lost his own mother to breast cancer in 1956, when he was only 14. The biggest difference between how Paul handled the death of his mother versus how John handled the same tragic situation in his own life was that while Paul was also crushed with extreme sadness and grief, he dealt with it via stoic escapism into music. John, on the other hand, seemed to retreat into extreme anger and became increasingly sullen and bitter even as he grew older. And sometimes he was even known to become violent.